Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody, depending on where you're calling in from. Welcome to today's webinar called Leadership Agility, Why It Matters and How It Changes Our Perspective. My name's Larry Cooper, and I'm the Agility Series channel facilitator. For those of you who don't know me, I was the mentor for the Prince2 Agile book, the lead author on Agile Value Delivery Beyond the Numbers, which was endorsed by a co-author of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development, as well as the recently released Adaptive Strategy Framework. The Agility Series channel brings you the latest ideas and research into agility across the organization, not just in software and product development. We have our own speakers as well as special invited guests who present on topics that enhance the discussion and hopefully our understandings on agility. The Agility Series will be releasing its first book on organizational agility later this week. And as attendees today, each of you will actually be the first one to receive free copies. I'll send out a link to everybody after the presentation where you'll be able to download it. Today's guest co-presenter is Kenneth Gonzalez, known to many by his nickname Ken Gon, and he's an internationally known and recognized author, speaker, and consulting professional. He's worked in technology since 1984 in multiple roles, from an individual contributor to executive management. Having extensive experience in systems and software design and development, support, and operations, Ken brings significant technical and business leadership skills to his customers, students, and workshop participants. He's also a recognized industry expert in service management and is regularly invited to write and give presentations internationally. Customers and practitioners alike appreciate Ken's clarity and helpful insights on managing expectations, delivering value, and producing tangible results. Welcome, Ken. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Larry. I'm really honored and to have the invitation to work and collaborate with you and be part of this presentation.
That's great. So let's get started. So how this actually came about was a couple of, I guess was, about 2 months ago, Ken? You wrote a blog post, and it was... he presented this nifty little diagram, if it's going to go forward for me. There we go.
Hey, there it is.
There it is. Called The Despair Cycle of Leadership. And so that kind of caught my eye once I sort of scanned the article, as I tend to do before I go read things. And so I was sort of wondering, well, what's that all about? Because that kind of goes counter to talking about leadership and how to get into it and how to be a good leader. As I read a little bit more, I kind of started to understand. So perhaps, Ken, you can kind of give our audience a little bit of a synopsis of what the despair cycle is really all about.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So, I would just ask our viewers to think about themselves for a moment, and that you come up against a situation where all of a sudden now there's an opportunity to lead, and it might be one of those kinds of situations where it might be really, really important, and you've got the opportunity to either make it or break it, and it all depends upon the leader being engaged, and it's your chance to step up. A lot of people have faced that kind of situation before. Larry and I were talking earlier about how he would just jump in and take it on. But other people would look at it and go, wow, there's a lot about that I don't know. There's a lot about that I don't understand. There's a lot about that I'm uncomfortable with. So I'm just actually either not going to lead, or they might say something like what we have in this self-assessment at the top at number 1, where, well, I'd really love to lead, but I'm not ready to lead yet. There's things I need to do. And there's a common sense to how leadership gets held in a lot of contexts that prevents people to actually opt themselves out of the game before they even have a chance to start, by using this negative self-assessment that I'm not ready to lead yet. And why I call this a despair cycle is because you start out, you're lacking confidence, you don't know whether you can do it because of the enormity of the challenge that you stand in front of. So the next activity you get into is, well, gee, if I think I'm not ready to lead yet, now I'm going to find out what it is that I don't know, that if I knew, I would actually be ready to lead. So you start making a long list of things, some of which may be valid, some of which may not be valid. And that takes time. Next, you start to, well, gee, if I've got this list and I know there's certain things, well, I absolutely have to know these things before I can lead. Then you come up with a plan to how do I come to know what those things are about what I don't know. And you go into training programs, you go into mentoring programs, you do all sorts of other things except actually starting to lead. So now you've got more time invested and you still don't think that you know what you need to know. So you get to activity number 4 where you actually compare, well, gee, how am I doing in terms of my training and development plan, my executive development plan, how my mentor thinks I'm doing, how other people think I'm doing related to that. At the end of it, you've done a whole bunch of work and none of it has gotten you into the game of leading yet. And it actually confirms your self-assessment that you started out with. I'm not ready to lead yet. So, and this despair cycle can actually continue because people will continue going round and round and round, trying to plug the holes in their knowledge and what are seemingly their inability to lead, and stay stuck there for entire careers. And that's what the despair cycle is about. It's about how do we how can we, number one, identify the cycle and then take an action to actually break it so that we actually can get into the game of leading and taking that on.
That's a lot to certainly digest. So let's kind of get started on, because one of the premises that we started out with setting up this talk today is about the fact that we believe that leadership is now called for far more than management is called for. And why would we think that? Because in the what Ken essentially just described there in my mind is very much the mode that a lot of organizations get into with their people because they're traditional hierarchies and things like that. And so their whole idea is premised on, in order to move up that hierarchy, then you must have certain skills or capabilities. And the only way to acquire those things is through educational programs. So there's really no other way to do it. And so that's sort of a management view where everybody's trying to manage what people do. And in so doing, they sort of set up these circumstances where, quite frankly, they don't get those opportunities to step in and lead. So maybe you want to start tackling the question about, why is leadership now far more important than management?
I think that one of the reasons that leadership is actually more important is we've got a whole history over the past 30 years of being able to deal with management. And people have been groomed to take on management positions where they understand how to organize, train, and equip personnel to fulfill, the mission of the organization. They become responsible for producing certain results, which goes along with that whole organize, train, and equip mentality. But all of that assumes that there's a certain background in place, that something that you're trying to support. It doesn't encourage people to actually, be engaged with setting direction or necessarily how do you influence others. And I think that in the name of agile leadership, looking at being able to, how can you not only influence others, but how can you shape the direction? Even if you don't get the opportunity to set it, how can you help shape and influence the direction? You may actually be in a position where you say you want to be at point Y, but you might not get there. But, the truth is it might not actually be in your organization's capability to get there. What can you actually produce? So in my mind, leadership involves being able to marshal all the resources that you have provided in your unique perspective and bring that to what everyone else is working on so that it actually forwards the game instead of standing back on your heels. Okay, well, you tell me what to do, and then I'll go do it.
Yeah, that's sort of fits into, because like in Agile, when we're teaching Agile, we're talking about learning by doing and inspecting and adapting, but we still have, there's still people who seem to think that leadership in Agile organizations is still something that you can only learn by having been taught it, which sort of goes counterintuitive to everything else that we say and think about Agile.
Yeah, really. You're going to come across challenges which you did not anticipate at the start of it. So if you're going to look for training that's going to handle all that stuff, you got a lot of training in front of you to deal with rather than, I think that all of us that are engaged in moving towards whatever objective we have, we're going to be able to figure out what are the bite-sized pieces that we can take that move us closer to where we need to be. So, it might even be more appropriate to call it just in time, so that you can actually bring those abilities online as they're needed rather than front-loading all of that.
Okay, so let's move on to question number 2. How do you recognize when things are changing during strategy execution? So the sort of the premise behind that question is, the whole notion of strategic planning, and when you go to execute strategy, and strategic planning is sort of premised on the notion that you can actually predict the future. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier about the adaptive strategy framework, so one of the things that we talk about in there is that strategy or a strategic goal, really all it is a statement of strategic intent. It's not reality. It's not something that will necessarily actually happen, but it just gives you a North Star to start going towards. And as you go through it, you need to adjust. So maybe you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, it's actually one of the things I love about the framework and the work that's been done, because I think that's really essential to what we expect for people to. When we say leadership, I believe that there's a call to leadership. Leadership isn't just the doing, but it's also in the domain of being, that you actually can go lead. And that does not imply that you have to know. It does not have to imply that it must be sorted out before you can begin. Now, you can actually get into it with the intention of having that get cleared up, get resolved, and tangibly move forward towards your objective. And that is, I think, one of the key differences between the leadership style and the management style. It's not we can toss one or the other out, but we need to be clear about what we're operating from when we are.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of, because one of the things, back to strategic planning for a moment, one of the things about strategic planning is the way these things tend to be done is that the leadership group comes up with it, but they leave it to the management group to actually execute towards it. So it's back to that whole thing. So they don't ever consider the possibility that maybe the goal is malformed. Maybe it's the wrong goal. So they never really get into that mode of thinking that during strategy execution, if the circumstances change, then they need to recognize that. They need to respond to that. They need to adapt to those changes.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that I have a model that's the 6R model of leadership. And one of the R's is about the realities. And leaders need to continually evaluate what sits in front of them, whether it's dealing with culture, whether it's dealing with what I'll call the sit stat, the situation status. What does the world actually look like right now compared to when you first started off in a direction? Does it continue to take in the assumptions, the expectations that were set when the initial course was communicated to people and then you embarked on your journey? a lot of times things shift, and leaders need to be looking for where those shifts are occurring and continually check back to see, are the assumptions being made in the area, is it still, are what we're working to, is it still now actually valid? Can we get there from here?
Yeah, and that's actually back to the adaptive strategy framework. That's why we kind of talk about the whole notion of strategic iteration. Like when people are doing product development and they're using agile approaches, their ideas, we'll build a little, deliver a little, try it, and then we adapt to what we see. Well, why aren't we doing that with our strategy? Why aren't we iterating our strategy and our strategy execution? Why aren't we refining our strategy as we move through strategy execution? Why are we assuming that our strategic goal can never change?
It's a good question. The other thing that goes along with that, Larry, is thinking about the scale of whatever it is that they're working on. Because some people might say, well, at the level of a development team or a combined delivery team, which has development, operations, and support resources in it, they very well might be able to deal with it effectively. But as you grow that, how do you account for the complexity that results by working on something much larger than what a appropriately sized team can deal with, and still not go nuts?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move on to our third question. How would you describe leadership, and how would you define its role?
So I would describe leadership as an operational orientation towards fulfilling what an organization has set it's out to become. And the role of leadership is to actually own what the accomplishment is, what expectations are, what the value is that they're trying to create, and bring that into fruition.
What do you think is at the core of good leadership?
I think at core, at the end of the day, it's going to end up being about relationships. How do you end up cultivating relationships and creating an environment in which people are free to contribute their strengths, their capabilities in a way which enables and upholds the team, rather than having things go into more of kind of like, well, I can do this, so that's the way I want you to use me, as a specialist working in a silo. But really a call which brings people together and has them work collaboratively, and oftentimes ways that they probably did not think they could before they started the project. Mm-hmm. And indeed, some of the best work that I think I've ever done has been where that neither I nor any of my team members knew how to do, but we came together with the intention to actually bring something into existence that hadn't existed before. And people were willing to give up their attachment to the things that they already knew, and were willing to become who they needed to be to actually see the project turn out well.
That's fascinating. I came along that line. I came across an article. It was probably a year or so ago. I don't recall the exact reference for it, but essentially what it was talking about in the context of teams, and saying that one of the real issues in traditional organizations is that, when they're looking at their people, they tend to focus on their weaknesses as part of performance evaluations and things like this, right? We got to find something wrong. You got to be able to work on something, right? So there's a tendency to focus on what people are not good at versus focusing on what people are good at. And there have actually been some studies done where they show that the brain actually develops more synapses when people are actually able to work to their strengths they actually become even much stronger. And so if you look at the composition of teams and the fact that, on a given team you need a lot of diversity in order to achieve goals, right? You can't have everybody being the same, right? That's why you want to have a group of people. So if you tend to focus on weaknesses as opposed to focusing on the strengths of the individuals, then you're really not going to create the total strength that you can have as a team.
Absolutely. And, from my experience in leading organizations, the thing I never did is never actually intentionally try to have somebody take a weakness and work on it. I always wanted to be in a position where I was providing an environment in which somebody could have their strengths be well used and brought forth, but also find areas where they could actually develop new capabilities. And that's from actually working on a weakness, because an area in which they want to develop is something that they're going to their own motivation, their own enthusiasm to actually work on, because it's something that's of interest to them and is of use inside whatever we're working on together. So I think that leaders are constantly looking for where that area is that they can go and bring their people along and let them develop, take on the next piece of work that they need to do to their next stage of development.
Absolutely. One of the things that I often talk about is the fact that experience can be an encumbrance to learning. And what I mean by that is, we get into this mode of, we've always done it a certain way. And so when you're trying to do new things or go towards new goals, sometimes you kind of have to unshackle yourself from the way you've thought about things. And, you mentioned earlier about a team that you were on, and it was because it was something new, no one had done it before, and everybody kind of had to let go a little bit, right, in order for the whole team to succeed, right? And I think that's probably perhaps one of the most important roles of a leader, in my mind, is to actually create the environment where that can happen, where people can sort of do things they've never done, right, and in ways they've never thought of before.
And still be accountable for what you've been tasked to do.
Yeah.
So it's not disconnected from your goals and objectives, but rather, keeping that in mind. You're doing these things simultaneously, and it's not like juggling or plates because something's eventually going to fall. You're actually doing one thing, and all of different things are aspects to it. So if you're doing it well, you're developing your people, you're producing outcomes, you're fulfilling expectations, you're paying attention to the accomplishment that you have in mind, all at the same time. One does not come at the expense of another. And if it does, you're doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm. That's true. The other thing that I sort of, over the years, have kind of noticed as well is there's a tendency back to the, experience can be an encumbrance to learning, but then there's also a tendency of too many leaders to sort of always go to, quote, the most experienced people first.
Yeah.
And my experience, at least in different situations, has been sometimes the best ideas actually come from the least experienced because of the fact that they're not jaded, right? They haven't been clouded by this whole thing we can get into of, that'll never work, right? Well, they don't know that it won't work because they've never done it, right? So they're willing to try things. They're willing to come up with new ideas.
And for those of you in the audience, if you've got questions, please use your Bright Talk panel to submit questions. Either Larry or I will pay attention to those, and we'll address them as we go along.
Yeah, actually, good point, actually. I've got it opened up here, so if there's anything you want to throw in as part of a supplementary to one of the questions that we've covered already or to the one that we are currently talking about, by all means do it, and we'll try and answer it for you. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth question. what are some of the challenges to achieving that level of leadership?
Well, two of them stand really out my mind. First is being resentful of what's required. So when you take on being a leader, there's always going to be something required of you beyond what you're already capable of. So being a leader is actually being responsible for the fact that you've got to develop yourself and develop others. And that's just part and parcel of the game. So if they're going to sit and be resentful of it, or be ticked off every time it stares you in the face, then you're just going to have a rough time of life. It's not going to turn out well. And the next thing that's related to it is that times change. As we started out the presentation with, we have the things that we've used in the past to actually have things turn out well as leaders won't necessarily be the same things that will be relevant for the next opportunity. So there's always going to be a different mix. You can't look at it from Larry, you'll recognize the term, the method perspective, where, I learn a method, I apply the method, therefore things turn out well. Well, in leadership, not so much. Yeah, there might be some underlying principles or things about it which are, consistent with things that have been in the past. But that, the programmatic method of just churning it out, not so much. You should expect that there's going to be changes, and that's going to be part of not only informs your development, but informs the development of the people in your team. That now, we have to take on this additional wrinkle, and that may really alter that method that we were using in the past. So you always have to be ready to bring new tools to the fight so you can go and do what you need to do and be successful at it.
Yeah, that's you talk about being tied to methods. I actually coined a phrase a few years ago called method lemmings to sort of cover that, because and people do tend to get caught up in these different methods that they learn as sort of it's the answer to everything, right? We can, as long as there's, I know this method, doesn't matter what happened, I'll be okay because I'm following this method. But as you said, the reality is that, circumstances are always changing. In fact, this is the other issue that, these days, we're no longer solving discrete problems, right? We're solving messes rather than problems. And when you're solving a mess, one of the things you have to realize is you don't actually know everything about the mess before you start. And the way you approach it, you're trying to understand it and solve it, can actually take you into solving the wrong problem. And it's because of the method that you're following. And so unless you're willing to be open to the fact that the approach you're using can take you down the wrong path, right, then you're not going to recognize that as a possibility, and you will go down the wrong path.
Heinrich Ibsen had a famous quote, "Never wear your best trousers when going out to fight for truth and freedom." And it really is a testament to the fact that it is messy, and you don't know what you're going to get into. But you have to be willing to get in there and persevere and stick to it. And that's not saying that you keep going and, it's an unwinnable battle. Some may be unwinnable, but still. Fact of the matter is you have to go in with the intent to see it turn out well.
Indeed. One of the other parts to it is, and you sort of alluded to it in the first part of answering the question, is the fact that because things change and circumstances change, that, who should be the leader in any given situation. Organizations are made up of lots of different kinds of people with all kinds of different backgrounds and experiences and capabilities. And, we kind of have this tendency that if someone is, quote, the leader, then they must always be the leader that leads, as opposed to in given different circumstances, it's quite okay for other people to step up into that role based on the fact that they may be the best suited.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does say something about an organizational culture too. I mean, because a lot of cultures, the leadership will be, well, I would not want to be a leader here because all of the leaders end up failing and getting fired. That's not what employees go around saying about the environment that they work in necessarily, but that's what, you know, people whisper to each other from cube to cube, and not taking what's in the background, that already culture that has people know about how things really work at our organization, is one of those challenges that leaders do need to take on as well, because you are responsible for the environment in which things are actually occurring.
Mm-hmm. So, sort of related to that, so what is it that you know, the people in an organization can actually fall back on? What's the real thing they can all fall back on and be able to say, well, as long as we're approaching it this way, you know, then we'll be always, you know, generally making a decision in the right direction for us.
Well, one hopes that actually is the case.
Yeah, true. But what I was sort of alluding to is the book that I referred to earlier, our first one that we'll be releasing in the next few days on organizational agility. So one of the things we talk about is the fact that, you know, it's the values and principles of the organization that the organization has and that the leaders live by. And that's what sort of sets everybody up to have that same shared understanding of, you know, what is generally the right thing to do in this organization, regardless of what's going on or what decision I'm asked to make or need to make in a given situation, right?
Yeah.
And if you have that premise, you know, that's kind of how you can overcome, you know, people really not knowing what to do, and how you can overcome, you know, part of that challenge of, you know, an organization where, you know, that has that reputation of, you know, if leaders don't succeed, the leaders are fired, you know, if they don't succeed in a given situation, right? Versus, you know, it's, you know, what do they all have to fall back on so that as a group they can feel comfortable that in most every situation they'll be able to do the right thing.
Yeah, and you make a very important point about that, Larry, because I think that the context that gets created and what people actually buy into, as opposed to buying into a person who's a leader.
Yeah.
But what it is, and this is what I found for myself in leading the teams I was telling you about, the difference was I didn't care if people were bought into me as a leader. What I was concerned about was, were they bought to what we were all working towards? That was the piece that I bought into, and I wanted people on my team that were actually bought into the same thing. So when it came time to make decisions, we knew that it wasn't about, well, gee, I like this person over here, so I'm going to give them my support whether they actually deserve it or not. Like, no, I'm going to take and evaluate all requests for support based upon how well that request actually lines up with what we're intending to produce.
Mm-hmm.
It really changes the game from a relational perspective, because now it takes the personal nature out of it. It doesn't matter whether you like somebody or not. You can actually be professional. You can have something turn out well for an organization and really not like somebody.
But and actually the opposite to that is the cult of the leader, right?
Yeah.
Where, you know, and you hear about all sorts of organizations where, you know, that are doing extremely well because they have a charismatic leader, and then everybody's talking about, well, what's going to happen when they leave?
Yeah.
Right. You know, what happens to, will that organization be as successful when they leave? Right.
Yeah.
And So that's a real challenge for leadership, right? Is to not cultivate the cult of the leader, but to cultivate the organization and its people.
Yeah, and to the extent that our existing leadership training models have us emphasized, so studying great leaders in the past is a worthwhile thing to do. To be able to look to see what did they do, how did they overcome adversity and get things done. But at the same time, to think that I'm going to be George Patton, and by emulating the thing and doing the things that George Patton did, does not mean that I'm going to become a good leader. It more than likely will mean that I'm going to be a bad George Patton.
Well, actually, you're going to be a bad you.
Yeah, really, at
right?
the end of it, yeah, that's true.
That's really what it is, right? It's like you can only be yourself, and that's kind of what you have to rely on. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go along to the next one. So what does leadership agility look like?
I think we've been dancing on this one for a couple of slides now. But I think leadership agility is more along the lines of getting clear about what the requirements are, being able to understand the expectations being set, what the accomplishment is that we're focused on, the situation, the organizational context, and getting everything lined up so that what's actually getting worked on is being appropriately addressed in the course of unfolding the project or initiative we happen to be engaged in. And wherever we see that people are disconnecting or not being part of whatever that larger conversation is, we bring them back to it. So it's about motivating and more about connecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also about as leaders recognizing the circumstances where others are actually stepping into leadership and facilitating them.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just about the goal at hand. It's also being able to recognize when people within the group are starting to exhibit a thing that they feel strongly about, that they want to get more involved in, and allowing that to happen so that they also can learn to be leaders.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
In the face of VUCA and the solving message solutions that comes with it, what would be the rational or relational soft skill behaviors that would be a key elements of leadership agility? So for everybody who doesn't know what VUCA is, it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it's to sort of capture the idea that, there's so many things going on around us that we can't actually control it. So we can't really manage change. All we can really do is try to manage at the pace of change.
And I think one of the key things that go to addressing, especially the VUCA portion, is what I was just saying there about that there's a level of communication required that isn't just about hearing and listening, or I should say, speaking and talking, or it's talking and listening, where it's about the words that come out of your mouth and that people can hear sounds and like that. There's that you are doing it, but everybody has had an experience, or at least everybody I've ever talked to has had the experience of being able to, you meet somebody and somebody asks you, hey, what do you think of this person? And you have the experience of, I don't trust them. Now, it might be that they're a trustworthy person and you just haven't gotten the sufficient relational background. That's point one, where you can actually develop a relational background sufficient to whatever accomplishment that you're working on that now is beginning to address whatever the VUCA stuff is actually sitting in the background, which is causing some sort of a disconnection between the parties that are going to work on the project. But it could also be that there's something actually being communicated in the background you can't hear, but communication goes beyond language. There's communication occurring all the time. And being able to not only trust that, but to use that to your benefit, which is, why when I was talking earlier about the conversation around the water cooler where people are having where it's like, well, that ain't the way things really work here, and I don't trust it's going to turn out well. Well, that's something that leaders actually need to tune into and start getting to the ground truth about. People just repeating the slogans back to you because that's what you're asked for and they don't want to lose their job? Or do they actually believe that, hey, this is what we're up to, this is where we're going, let's go, we're with you. You don't want to be the kind of person, the leader that's out and finding that there's nobody behind you supporting you.
Well, yeah, actually, that's sort of along the lines of something else that for me I've always sort of wondered about in a lot of organizations, right? And going back to strategy, so the idea that leaders develop strategic plans and management executes. So it's like, well, what could be more important to a leader than actually executing on their strategy? So why do they feel it's okay to disengage, right? And so it sort of gets into what you're talking about there about, having a sense of what's really going on, what the real issues are, and being a part of the conversation, being involved, being engaged, right? And you can't do that if you turn over what you're saying is the most important thing we should be doing to someone else. You're not leading.
Yeah.
Right? It's a fire and forget mentality.
And if you can't have that conversation about what's actually happening here with whoever started off the conversation about, okay, here's where we're going now. If you can't deal with the issues or the inappropriately set expectations that go along with what you're doing, well, guess what? You're not leading.
Mm-hmm.
As uncomfortable as it might be, if you've been charged with taking leadership of something, go. And you find that there's something that now, just right smack dab in the middle of it that's going to prevent you from getting, and you can't have that. You're not free to have that conversation. You're not free to lead. You got to take that one on.
Mm-hmm. So from a behavior's perspective, it's your level of engagement and commitment, right? And how much do you trust the people around you, right? And how much do they trust you, and how do they develop that trust with you? To know that, if you say that this is what we're going to do, that they actually believe that you mean it, that you're going to see it through. You're to make sure either
that
it does happen
works
or
in three different directions.
Yeah, or what does happen is because we arrived at the same place together because that was also the right thing to do. Back to the issue of, you can't predict the future, right? Yeah, you have to, react to what you find along the way. But it's the level of engagement. So the real behavior to me is how, engaged you're willing to be, how transparent you're willing to be, and how trusting you're willing to be.
Yeah. Trust is an interesting thing because a lot of people have a conversation about trust that's very binary. Either you're trusting or you're not. Yes. And that's a very immature view of trust because, and I will assert here that trust has two elements to it. The first is actually given. So you are trusting as part of, what, you need to start somewhere. So there is a level of trust that has to be granted. And then there's also a level of trust that can be earned. So you can actually deepen that trust. You can make that richer than it had been when you started. And to the extent you're successful in doing that, you can actually take on larger, more complicated, more uncertain things and have them expect that they'll turn out. Why? Because you're developing a new foundation in which you work with other people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the trust is.
Yeah, one of the things that we were talking about earlier, a company I mentioned, W.L. Gore and Associates. And so when you talk about trust, right? So in that organization, people don't get assigned to managers; they choose who to follow. And so the first thing that you talk about trust, right? So they're trusting their, the people, their associates, to make the right choices about who to go follow. But they're also trusting, the people who those people are following to be doing the right things, right?
Yeah.
And kind of how they did that is they have it's like 4 or 5 kind of base principles that they rely on. And one of them, which was actually kind of interesting when I read it, was like, no one person can bring the company down. And
yeah.
And if you think about that for a second, right, and you go, gee, that kind of means that the ultimate leader, right, the top leader in the company, does not have that power to do that.
Mm.
It's really not so much around, necessarily all the layers. I think it says a lot about what their expectation is starting at the top, right? And that's their sort of final thing is no one person could actually take us down, because we are, because then people will not follow them. And, using their other values and principles to rely on kind of taking care of that. Okay, so let's move on to our last question. So for the listener who asked the question, hopefully we've answered your question. If not, by all means, feel free to do a supplementary. So the last question: what are some of the key takeaways that we can leave with our audience on leadership agility?
Well, the first takeaway, I think, is that it was the fundamental premise of the blog and where we started off is that leadership is developed. What it takes to actually lead is developed by actually leading. So if leading is a direction of interest for you, then I would recommend finding an opportunity to lead, no matter how grand or small you might think it is. But use that as the opportunity to be in the game of developing yourself as a leader and taking that ground, because the more you engage in it, the more capable you will be. And scale really does not matter. It doesn't matter whether you think it's big or small. The muscle you develop through actually practicing leading is developable all the time and can be leveraged in a lot of different areas. Because it doesn't matter whether it's a tech area, a non-tech area, sports, leisure activities. If there's an opportunity to lead, take it. It's a good place to start.
Yeah, just the point you mentioned early in the conversation about what we were talking about beforehand, and from my own personal experience, a lot early in my career, my tendency was, when there was a situation that no one else wanted to tackle, that's the one I went after. And it was all because, hey, I haven't done that. Let's try it. And what's the worst thing can happen? Well, I can fail, but no one else wants it, so, maybe the consequences won't be so bad if I do.
Well,
because they really didn't expect anybody to take it anyway.
In this respect, Larry, you and I were very, very much 180 degrees of each other. I found earlier in my career I was very risk averse. I would not want to do things which would actually make me appear as less capable, not as informed, not as successful as other people. And I know the despair cycle well, because having lived it, I really got to see the mechanism at play in how I interact with the world. I would, just avoid putting myself in situations where I felt uncomfortable, or I didn't think I knew what I needed to know. I didn't have the skills. I didn't have the abilities. And being at this point in my career, the thing I can now look back and see is that it was all about my sense of self and an evaluation of self which was really overly critical. And I think that from a personal perspective, a lot of us tend to be overly critical of ourselves and what we're capable of. And by being able to turn off that criticism, revolving tape which keeps going in the background, if we can silence that for just long enough to get engaged and come in and say, okay, great, what needs to happen? Who do I need to become to have this turn out well?
Yeah.
That can make all the difference in the world for somebody from somebody who never considered that they could lead to actually leading and leading successfully.
Absolutely.
We all deserve that.
Yeah, that kind of leads to a sort of another one that we've been kind of dancing around throughout the whole conversation, which is, leadership agility is not just a personal trait; it's an organizational one. So, in my case, I was a bit sort of, I guess, less risk averse, in spite of whatever was going on around me. But really, if you want to have exhibit true leadership agility as an organization, it has to be an organizational trait. It has to be, you have to create the circumstances for, not just people like me, what I was like early in my career, but also people like you, that they'll feel the safety to step up, into those roles.
Yeah. Well, and while you're on the topic of safety, I think that an important thing to recognize is safety is in the eye of the beholder, and there really is no ever safe time for a leader, because there's always going to be something that's stretch you, that's going to expose you, that's going to be demanding something for you that you don't already have on board. Mm-hmm. And so I think that one of the we want to get used to, especially for those that are interested in leading, is not, you can pay attention to your gut and then put it aside. Because if you keep trying to take advantage or trying to lead with the basis being how you feel or what your assessment is of something that, is based upon your internal conversation, that's that negative self-assessment, you're never going to get past go. So there has to be something beyond that where it's just like, okay, let me engage and now actively assess based upon what the conditions I find where the leadership actually is occurring. Mm-hmm. That's a much better place to take and evaluate from than that whole internal states conversation and hoping that turns out well, where the next time I lead, I'm going to feel bad about it.
Yeah.
Not a good place to start.
That's true. That's very true. And I guess, so that kind of is a bit of another segue into another one, which is, and we've kind of talked about this as well, which is the fact that, no two sets of circumstances are going to be alike. So even though, you may have, not quite succeeded or not succeeded, or even if you did extremely well in the current circumstance, there's no guarantee that you'll enjoy the same success on the next one, right? And
right.
So that's sort of what that gets into, which is kind of what we've been sort of alluding to, is the fact that it really is premised in having adaptive behaviors, as an individual, right? And encouraging that as an organization that current success is no guarantee of future success, just like, current failure is no guarantee of a future failure, right? And part of that is like in the middle of when things are happening is of being able to listen and observe to what's actually happening versus what you expected. So having that fixed view of the future is to try and get yourself away from that. And to start recognizing what's actually occurring in real time and adapting to it.
I think one of the other things that goes along with that, Larry, is if we use as our key Nobody ever starts a project intending for it to fail. We start out with good intentions. We want to see the things that we're taking on be successful because there's a reason why they're attractive, why we want those outcomes, why we want that value created. But if we don't, and this is not to take and rationalize a failure, but I mean, you can literally go and take inventory and see what happened. What came of what we started to go to work on? Even in a failure, there's still a lot of potential value to be had. And that value may only be setting yourself up for the next time that you can team. How much of a head start can you get? What did you take away from it that now puts you at an advanced level of delivery capability that you didn't have before?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to take and lose any goodness in the face of a failure. Yeah, let's acknowledge the failure, but let's also appreciate what got built in the interim.
Exactly. So I guess the last one that I can think of is, and again we've talked about this quite a bit, is the fact that leadership agility occurs at all levels. It's not something that's exclusive because you've been given the title of leader. And that sort of goes into the whole idea of, what's our premise for how we make decisions, right? And as long as we have a shared premise about how we're going to make decisions, then that's value-centered, then we're probably going to be okay. And it'll create the environment where in different circumstances people will feel, or not even feel, it's just sort of by natural action of working within a team on any given day. It can almost be down to a day level. In a given, we're facing a current problem, and one of the team members sort of steps in and kind of takes the lead on figuring out. Just kind of emerges as a leader in that situation.
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on that. I mean, because from the teams that I've been running, I was always intent on ensuring that everybody had a piece to lead and that they were fully enabled to actually take it and run with it. And I think one of the characteristics of a good leader is that they create the conditions for new leaders to sprout up around them. And that can be as simple as technical leadership. It could be project level leadership. It could be coordinating and communicating with others. I mean, it doesn't matter how that leadership expresses itself, that people are encouraged and actually take on leading of their own volition because they now see how it connects to the bigger thing that we're working on together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way that I can say I can, if I'm being effective, is if more people are inspired and take on leading around me.
Well, on that note, I think that's actually probably the best statement we could have come up with to actually summarize what we've been talking about. So I thank you very much, Ken, for agreeing to participate today. I really enjoyed it. Fantastic conversation. I hope everybody who listened in found it valuable. Before you guys check out, if you could go to the feedback section and give us some feedback on what you thought about it today, and any comments, certainly appreciate that as well. So Ken, any parting thoughts?
I'm just really thankful to everybody who showed up. I take anybody's time for granted, and I appreciate that you took the hour to take and spend with me, spend with Larry, and I echo his comment that I hope you found it valuable, and look forward to hearing from everybody.
Okay, thank you guys. Really appreciate you tuning in as usual. I'd encourage you to encourage some of your colleagues to check us out on the Agility Series channel. We also have a LinkedIn group called the Agility Series. If you're interested, you can send me an email. Just let me pull that up here. So you can send me an email at larry.cooper@bssnexus.com. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or on Twitter at CooperLK99. And I'll be sending an email to everybody as well anyways with the link to the Org Agility book that'll be coming out in the next few days. And as I said, check us out on the LinkedIn group. One of the things about that actually is we're about to start the next book, which is on leadership agility, and how we do it is by creating a series of questions that we ask of participants to weigh in on. Based on the responses we get, we then come up with what we think are a representative set of key phrases for each question, and we get people to rank those as well. We're trying to encourage as many people as we can to participate with us in this. There's 9 types of agility, and when you go check out the LinkedIn group, you'll see where all that's explained. So thank you again. Hope to engage you more in our little adventure, and hope to have some of you online with us again. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a great day.